I hadn't planned on staying in this town longer than 6 months. That was 3 months ago, and I was still here, still renting the furnished studio above Mrs. Chen's bakery, still waking up to the smell of fresh bread and the sound of delivery trucks rattling down cobblestone streets that belonged in a postcard. "You need to get out more," Sarah had said over lunch, picking at her salad while I stared at my untouched sandwich. She was the only person at the marketing firm who'd bothered to learn my name in the first week, which made her my default friend by proximity rather than choice. "There's a book club at that little place on Maple Street. Very intellectual, very your speed." She said it like being intellectual was a consolation prize, which maybe it was. I'd been collecting consolation prizes for months now. The bookstore was smaller than I'd expected, wedged between a vintage clothing shop and a place that sold artisanal candles. Cornerstone Books read the hand-painted sign, letters slightly crooked in a way that suggested charm rather than carelessness. Through the window, I could see shelves crammed floor to ceiling, books stacked horizontally on top of vertical rows, the kind of organized chaos that made librarians weep and book lovers feel at home. I was 20 minutes early, which was either eager or pathetic, depending on your perspective. The discussion was supposed to start at 7, and it was only 6:40. I pushed open the door, setting off a brass bell that seemed too loud for the quiet space. "Evening," called a woman from behind the counter. She was maybe 60, with steel gray hair pulled back in a loose bun and reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain. "Book club?" "Maybe," I said, which was honest enough. "They meet in the back room. Coffee's on the house for members." She gestured toward a narrow hallway lined with poetry collections. "Feel free to browse. Most folks don't show up until the last minute anyway." I nodded and wandered deeper into the store, running my fingers along book spines the way other people might worry prayer beads. Fiction was in the middle section, organized alphabetically but with the kind of creative interpretation that comes from years of customers reshelving books wherever they found space. I pulled out a copy of The Great Gatsby, not because I wanted to read it again, but because my hands needed something to do. The pages fell open to a passage I'd underlined in college, back when I thought literary analysis might unlock some secret about how to live. Nick Carraway observing Gatsby's parties from a distance, always watching, never quite participating. I'd identified with Nick then, which should have been a warning sign about the kind of person I was becoming. I was still holding the book when I felt it, that particular weight of being watched. Not the casual glance of someone browsing nearby, but the focused attention of someone actually looking at me. Specifically, I turned, trying to make it seem natural, and saw him. He was standing 3 shelves over in what looked like the literary fiction section, holding a book I couldn't identify from this distance. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. Dark hair with just enough gray at the temples to suggest he'd earned it through experience rather than genetics. He wore a navy sweater that had seen better years, and jeans that fit like they'd been bought for comfort rather than fashion. But it was his eyes that stopped me. Gray-green, like lake water in winter, and tired. Not sleepy tired, but tired in the way that comes from carrying too much for too long. The kind of tired that settles into your bones and changes how you stand. He was looking at me with the same careful attention I'd been giving to book spines, not staring exactly, more like cataloging, taking inventory. When our eyes met, neither of us looked away immediately, which created one of those moments that stretches longer than it should, like a held breath or a pause between musical notes. Then he blinked, glanced down at his book, and I remembered I was supposed to be breathing. I put Gatsby back on the shelf and moved toward the mystery section, mostly because it was in the opposite direction and I needed to think about something other than the way his sweater had stretched across his shoulders when he'd reached for a book on a higher shelf. "Book club starting," the woman from the counter called out. "Back room through the poetry section." The back room turned out to be a generous description for what was essentially a wide hallway with a folding table and 8 mismatched chairs. Someone had made an effort with the lighting, table lamps instead of overhead fluorescents, and there was a coffee station set up on a card table against the wall. Classical music played softly from a speaker that looked older than I was. 5 people were already seated when I arrived, making the usual small talk that happens when strangers are forced into proximity by shared interests. I took a seat near the middle of the table, close enough to participate, but far enough from the head to avoid being called on like an unprepared student. He came in 2 minutes later. Without looking around the room or acknowledging anyone in particular, he took the chair at the far end of the table, the one that would let him observe everyone else without being directly in anyone's line of sight. Smart positioning. I might have chosen the same spot if I'd arrived later. "Well then," said a woman with enthusiastic red lipstick and a stack of sticky notes. "Shall we begin? I'm Janet, for those who don't know me. I teach high school English, so I promise not to turn this into a pop quiz." Polite laughter. Someone mentioned this was their first time. Janet launched into what was clearly a practiced introduction about the value of literary discussion and how books were meant to be shared experiences, not solitary ones. The book was The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. I'd gotten through about half of it before life had gotten complicated and reading had become another thing I couldn't focus on. Stevens the butler, devoted to service, missing every opportunity for human connection because duty was safer than desire. It wasn't subtle symbolism, but sometimes the obvious truths are the ones we need spelled out. "What did everyone think of Stevens as a narrator?" Janet asked, pulling out a pair of reading glasses. "Reliable? Unreliable? Something in between?" The usual book club dynamics emerged quickly. There was the woman who'd clearly read 3 different analyses online and was determined to share all of them. The man who related everything back to his own experiences, usually involving his ex-wife. The quiet woman who made thoughtful comments but had to be drawn out with direct questions. And him, he said nothing for the first 20 minutes, just listened with the same careful attention he'd given me in the fiction section. He'd brought his own copy of the book, and I could see it was well read. Pages soft with handling, margins filled with notes in small, precise handwriting. He held it differently than the others, like he was still reading it even while listening to the discussion. "The tragedy isn't that Stevens missed his chance with Miss Kenton," said the woman with the online research. "It's that he convinced himself he never wanted the chance in the first place." A few people nodded. Someone mentioned repression and duty and the English class system. Standard observations, all correct, all missing something essential. I found myself speaking before I decided to. "Maybe it's not about missing chances," I said quietly. "Maybe it's about being so afraid of wanting something that you pretend you don't want it until the pretending becomes real." The room went quiet for a moment. Janet made an encouraging noise and opened her mouth to respond, but then his voice cut through the silence, soft and certain. "That's exactly what I thought, too." He didn't look up from his book when he said it. Didn't look at me or anyone else. Just stated it like a fact, the way you might mention the weather or the time. But something in his tone made it clear he wasn't agreeing for the sake of agreement. He meant it. The discussion continued around us, Janet steering the conversation toward themes of duty versus personal fulfillment, someone else bringing up the unreliable narrator again, but I found myself only half listening. I kept glancing at the man at the end of the table, trying to read the notes he'd written in his margins, wondering what other thoughts we might share without speaking them aloud. He caught me looking once, and this time he didn't look away immediately. For maybe 3 seconds, we just observed each other across the table while Janet explained the significance of the novel's post-war setting. Then he turned a page in his book, and I pretended to be fascinated by my own copy. The hour went faster than I'd expected. People began gathering their things, making the usual noises about seeing everyone next week, promising to actually finish the next selection on time. I was in no hurry to leave. The studio above the bakery was waiting for me with its single window and its carefully maintained neutrality, the kind of space that never demanded anything but never offered anything either. I was reaching for my coffee cup when it happened. The woman with the sticky notes, I'd already forgotten her name, knocked over her travel mug while reaching for her purse. Coffee spread across the table in a dark puddle, heading straight for someone's copy of the book and a stack of printed discussion questions. Without thinking, I lunged forward with my napkin. At the same moment, a hand appeared from the other direction with a handful of paper towels. Our fingers brushed as we both reached for the spill, and the contact was brief enough to be accidental but long enough to be significant. His hands were warm and slightly rough, like he worked with them. There was a thin scar across his knuckles that spoke of some old accident or careful work gone slightly wrong. When we touched, he went very still for just a moment, not pulling away but not pressing forward either, just present. "Sorry," he said quietly, pulling his hands back and letting me take the spill. Thought I could get there first. "No problem," I managed, though my voice came out rougher than I'd intended. He helped clean up without making it into a production, efficient and quiet, while the woman with the travel mug apologized to everyone in a 3-foot radius. When the crisis was resolved and the table was merely damp instead of flooded, he gathered his things and left without saying goodbye to anyone. I stayed a few more minutes, making conversation with Janet about next week's selection, but my attention kept drifting to the chair where he'd been sitting. He'd left no trace of himself except a slight indentation in the cushion, and the memory of his voice saying, "That's exactly what I thought too." Walking home, I tried to convince myself that the evening had been exactly what I'd expected: mildly interesting, moderately social, completely forgettable. Sarah would ask how it went, and I'd tell her it was fine, which was true enough. The people were nice, the discussion was adequate. I might go back next week, or I might not. But I was still thinking about tired gray-green eyes and careful hands, and the way someone could listen so intently it felt like a form of attention I'd forgotten existed. The studio was exactly as I'd left it, which was both comforting and depressing. Same unmade bed, same stack of unread books on the nightstand, same carefully maintained distance from anything that might require emotional investment. I'd gotten good at living in spaces that couldn't hurt me because they'd never meant anything in the first place. It hadn't always been like this. There'd been another apartment in another city with another man whose name I still couldn't say out loud, Michael, who'd filled bookshelves with novels I'd never heard of and introduced me to authors who wrote about longing like it was an art form, who'd made coffee in the morning and left the newspaper folded to the crossword puzzle because he knew I liked to solve them during breakfast. We'd been together 2 years when the silence started. Not the comfortable quiet that comes from knowing someone well enough that words become optional, the other kind. The kind that grows in the spaces where a conversation used to live, fed by all the things you stopped saying because saying them would require admitting they're true. I'd started working later. He'd started going out with friends I'd never met. We'd moved around each other in that apartment like polite strangers, careful not to bump into each other's lives. The books stayed on the shelves, but neither of us was reading them anymore. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. Not a fight or a betrayal or any of the dramatic conclusions that make good stories. Just Michael standing in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, still in his robe, saying, "I think we both know this isn't working anymore." And the terrible thing was, I did know, had known for months. We'd been pretending so well that even the pretending had started to feel like effort. I'd moved out that weekend, left the city 2 weeks later, told myself I was starting over, but starting over implies you're building something new rather than just running away from something that died slowly enough that you couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it stopped breathing. 3 months in this new town, and I'd successfully avoided anything that might turn into a connection. Work was work, the studio was shelter, Sarah was friendly, but not too friendly. I'd constructed a life that was perfectly safe because it was perfectly shallow. So why was I thinking about a man I'd barely spoken to, whose name I didn't even know? I made coffee I didn't want and opened a book I couldn't concentrate on. Outside the window, the town settled into its evening routine. Porch lights coming on, the last of the dinner crowd leaving the restaurant across the street, couples walking dogs and discussing their days in voices too quiet to make out the words. It was the kind of scene that would have made Michael sentimental. He'd have pointed out the way the streetlights caught the autumn leaves, or made some observation about the poetry of ordinary moments. I'd have agreed because I usually did agree with Michael, and we'd have stood there together looking out at other people's lives and feeling connected to something larger than ourselves. But Michael wasn't here, and I wasn't the kind of person who found poetry in streetlights anymore. I was the kind of person who went to book clubs alone and left without learning anyone's name. Except I couldn't stop thinking about the way the man at the end of the table had said, "That's exactly what I thought too." Like recognition, like relief, like finding out you're not the only person in the room who's been thinking thoughts you can't quite name. I told myself I wouldn't go back next week. Thursday came and went. Friday dragged by with the particular weight of a week that had contained nothing memorable except one brief moment of accidental contact and a few exchanged glances across a folding table. Sarah asked about the book club over coffee in the break room. "How was your literary evening?" she asked, stirring sugar into her cup with a kind of aggressive enthusiasm that meant she was genuinely curious. "Meet any interesting people?" "It was fine," I said, which was becoming my default response to most questions about my life. "Good discussion, nice group. Are you going back?" I almost said no automatically, the way you deflect questions that come too close to things you haven't figured out yet. But something made me pause. "Maybe," I said instead. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Maybe usually means yes when it comes to things you claim you're not interested in." She wasn't wrong, but I wasn't ready to examine what that meant. Saturday, I found myself walking past Cornerstone Books on my way to nowhere in particular. The vintage clothing shop was busy with weekend browsers, and the candle store had some kind of fall display in the window featuring small pumpkins and tea lights. The bookstore looked quiet, almost empty except for the woman with the gray hair. Janet? No, that was the book club leader. This was someone else. I kept walking. Sunday, I tried to read The Remains of the Day, and got further than I had before. Stevens walking through the English countryside, finally allowing himself to think about Miss Kenton, about chances missed and words unspoken, about the way duty can become a prison you build so carefully you forget you're the one holding the keys. By Monday, I'd admitted to myself that I was going back to the book club. By Tuesday, I was annoyed with myself for caring. By Wednesday, I was trying to decide if it mattered what I wore to a literary discussion in the back room of a bookstore, which was ridiculous enough that I settled on the same jeans and sweater I'd worn the week before. If it was good enough for accidental recognition, it was good enough for whatever this was. Thursday evening found me standing outside Cornerstone Books again, 10 minutes early again, telling myself I was there for the discussion and not because I wanted to see if he'd come back too. The same brass bell announced my arrival. The same woman looked up from behind the counter, though this time she smiled with the recognition of someone who'd been expecting me. "Back for more punishment?" she asked cheerfully. "Something like that." "Coffee's fresh. Janet's setting up in the back." I nodded and headed for the poetry section, but this time I didn't pretend to browse. I went straight to the back room where Janet was arranging the same mismatched chairs around the same folding table. Two people were already seated, the woman with the sticky notes and a man I didn't recognize from the previous week. "Good to see you again," Janet said, looking up from a stack of discussion questions. "I wasn't sure if we'd scared you off with all our literary enthusiasm." "Not scared off," I said, taking the same seat I'd occupied the week before. Looking forward to the discussion, which was true, or at least partially true. I was looking forward to something. More people arrived over the next few minutes. The woman who related everything to her ex-wife, a new face, someone who introduced himself as David and mentioned he'd just moved to town from Portland, the quiet woman who made thoughtful comments. 7 o'clock came and went. Janet made noises about getting started, but she kept glancing toward the doorway like she was waiting for someone. At 7:05, he appeared. Same navy sweater, though it might have been a different one. I wasn't close enough to tell if it had the same small hole near the left elbow. Same careful way of taking in the room before choosing his seat. Same position at the far end of the table where he could observe without being observed. He caught my eye as he sat down, and this time he nodded slightly. Not quite a greeting, more like an acknowledgement. I nodded back, and something that might have been relief settled in my chest. "Wonderful," Janet said, pulling on her reading glasses. "Now that everyone's here, let's dive in." The book this week was Never Let Me Go, also by Ishiguro. I'd actually finished this one, mostly because I'd started it on Sunday and found myself unable to put it down. The story of Kathy and Tommy and Ruth growing up in what seemed like an idyllic boarding school until you slowly realized what they were really being prepared for. What did everyone think of the way Ishiguro reveals information? Janet asked. The way we gradually understand what Helsham really is? The discussion started the same way as the week before, the woman with the online research leading off with observations about narrative structure and unreliable narrators, the man with the ex-wife relating the story to his own experiences with institutional life, whatever that meant. But this week felt different. Maybe it was because I'd actually finished the book, or maybe it was because I was less focused on being nervous and more focused on listening. Or maybe it was because I kept glancing at the man at the end of the table, watching him make notes in margins, waiting for him to speak. The tragedy isn't that they can't escape their fate, someone was saying. It's that they never really try to escape, they accept it. But do they have a choice? Asked the quiet woman. They've been conditioned from childhood to accept this role. Is acceptance really acceptance if you've never been given alternatives? That's the question, isn't it? Janet said, clearly pleased with the direction of the discussion. Free will versus determinism, nature versus nurture. I found myself thinking about the way Kathy talked about her memories, how she circled around the painful truths, approaching them sideways rather than head-on. The way people do when they're trying to tell themselves stories that make the unbearable bearable. Maybe acceptance isn't the right word, I said, before I'd fully formed the thought. Maybe it's more like resignation. When you've been told your whole life that something is inevitable, fighting it starts to feel like fighting yourself. Several people nodded. Janet made an encouraging noise and was about to respond when his voice cut through the room again, soft and certain. That's exactly what I thought too. This time he did look up, directly at me with those gray-green eyes that seemed to see more than they should. The same words as the week before, but delivered with more intention, like he was making sure I heard them. The discussion continued, but I was having trouble following it. All my attention had narrowed to the man at the end of the table, who'd gone back to making notes in his book, but kept glancing up in my direction. Not staring, just checking, like he was making sure I was still there. When the meeting ended, I lingered again. This time I helped Janet stack the chairs, mostly because it gave me an excuse to stay while other people gathered their things and made their exit plans. The man at the end of the table was taking his time putting his book away, sliding it into a worn leather messenger bag with the care of someone who'd learned to treat books like treasures. Same time next week? Janet asked, pulling on a cardigan that had seen better decades. Probably, I said, which was more commitment than I'd planned to make. Good. We're doing The Handmaid's Tale. Should be a lively discussion. She headed for the front of the store, leaving me alone in the back room with the man who'd been watching me. He finished packing his bag and stood up, but instead of heading for the exit, he paused. Good observation, he said quietly, about resignation versus acceptance. Thanks. I tried to think of something else to say, something that might extend the conversation, but my mind went blank. I thought your comment about conditioning was interesting too. He almost smiled, not quite, but something around his eyes shifted in a way that suggested amusement. We should probably head out, he said. Janet likes to lock up by 8:30. I nodded and followed him toward the front of the store. We walked in silence through the poetry section, past the counter where Janet was doing something with the register, toward the door with its brass bell. Outside, the evening was crisp with the first real bite of autumn. The streetlights had come on, casting everything in that particular orange glow that makes familiar places look slightly mysterious. A few other book club members were visible down the street, walking toward the parking area behind the coffee shop. Well, I said, because someone had to say something. See you next week, I guess. Yeah, he said. See you next week. But neither of us moved. We stood there on the sidewalk outside Cornerstone Books, two people who'd run out of reasonable excuses to keep talking but weren't quite ready to walk away. I was about to say goodnight when he spoke again. You walked past the poetry shelf, twice. The observation was so unexpected, so specific, that I actually took a step back. What? Last week, before the meeting started, you walked past the poetry section twice without looking at any of the books. I stared at him. You were watching me? He shrugged, but there was something almost defensive in the gesture. I noticed things. That's, I struggled for words, creepy, flattering, confusing. That's very observant of you. Poetry's usually the first thing people look at in a bookstore like this, he said as if that explained anything. Either you love it or you're afraid of it, but you don't ignore it. Maybe I just don't read poetry. Maybe. But his tone suggested he didn't believe it. We were having the strangest conversation, standing on a sidewalk in a town where I didn't know anyone's last name, talking about poetry with a man whose first name I'd never learned. It should have felt awkward, but instead it felt like we were finally getting to the real reason we'd both come back this week. There's a better one around the corner, he said suddenly, if you're staying. A better what? Poetry section. The bookstore on Oak Street has a whole room dedicated to poetry. Better selection than Janet's place. I looked at him, trying to read the expression on his face in the orange streetlight. Was this an invitation, a suggestion, a test? Are you staying? I asked. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. Like he hadn't expected me to turn the question back on him. Yeah, he said quietly. I'm staying. And then he started walking, not toward the parking area where the other book club members had gone, but around the corner toward Oak Street. After a moment's hesitation, I followed. The bookstore on Oak Street was called Pages and Prose, and it was 3 times the size of Cornerstone Books. Still independent, still cramped with books, but organized with the kind of professional attention that suggested someone had actually studied library science. The poetry section was exactly what he'd promised. An entire room lined floor to ceiling with collections ranging from ancient Greek translations to chapbooks by local authors I'd never heard of. How did you know about this place? I asked, running my fingers along a shelf of contemporary American poets. I come here sometimes, when I need to think. There was something in his voice that made me look up from the books. He was standing near a display of Rilke translations, holding a slim volume like he'd picked it up without thinking. Do you write poetry? I asked. God, no. The response was immediate, almost sharp. Then, more quietly, I just read it sometimes, when other words aren't enough. I understood that, the feeling of needing language that worked differently, that approached meaning from angles prose couldn't reach, poetry as emergency kit for emotions you couldn't name. What do you do? I asked. For work, I mean. He looked up from the Rilke, and for a moment I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, carpenter, custom furniture mostly, kitchen cabinets, built-ins, things that are supposed to last. That explained the hands, the slight roughness, the scar across his knuckles. It also explained something about the way he carried himself, like someone who was used to measuring twice and cutting once, who'd learned patience through repetition and precision. That sounds, I searched for the right word, satisfying, making things that last. Sometimes. He put the Rilke back on the shelf. What about you? Marketing, for a firm downtown, very temporary, very forgettable. Forgettable on purpose? The question was too perceptive, too close to things I hadn't said out loud. I pulled a book from the shelf at random, selected poems of W.S. Merwin, and flipped through pages without reading them. Maybe, I said finally. We browsed in comfortable silence for a while, occasionally pulling books from shelves and reading first lines or dedication pages. He moved through the poetry section like someone who knew what he was looking for, though he didn't seem to be looking for anything specific. More like he was visiting old friends, checking in to make sure they were still there. I should probably head home, I said eventually, though I wasn't sure why. The studio above the bakery would be exactly as I'd left it, offering nothing more compelling than the company of someone who understood why poetry mattered even when, especially when, you couldn't explain why. Yeah, he said. Me too. But again, neither of us moved immediately. We stood there in the poetry room of a bookstore that stayed open too late, surrounded by other people's attempts to make sense of longing and loss and the spaces between words. I'm David, by the way, I said suddenly. I know we've been having these conversations without introductions, but Marcus, he said, and we haven't really been having conversations, more like parallel observations. Is that what this is? He considered the question seriously, which I was beginning to realize he did with most questions. I'm not sure yet, he said finally. We walked back toward Maple Street together, not quite side by side, but not quite separately either. The distance between us felt carefully maintained, like we were both aware of some invisible boundary that shouldn't be crossed too quickly. Thank you, I said when we reached the corner where our paths would diverge, for showing me the poetry room. You're welcome. He paused, then added, Will you go back to Pages and Prose? Probably. I realized it was true as I said it. Will you? Probably. Another pause, the kind that feels like it should be filled with something more significant than good night. See you next week? I asked. Yeah, Marcus said. See you next week. I watched him walk away down Oak Street, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched against the evening chill. When he disappeared around the next corner, I stood there for another moment trying to figure out what had just happened. I'd gone to a book club, I'd had a discussion about literature, I'd been shown a better poetry section by someone who noticed things like which shelves people avoided and why that might matter. It should have been simple, friendly but not too friendly, intellectual but not too intimate, the kind of encounter that fits neatly into the category of pleasant evening without demanding anything more. But walking home to my studio above the bakery, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Not dramatically. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in dramatic shifts anymore. More like a recalibration, a slight adjustment in the way I was orienting toward the world. Marcus, who built things that were supposed to last, who read poetry when other words weren't enough, who'd been watching me carefully enough to notice that I'd avoided the poetry shelf twice and who'd cared enough to mention it. I was still thinking about tired gray-green eyes and careful hands when I fell asleep that night. And for the first time in months, I dreamed about something other than the apartment I'd left behind and the silence that had grown there like mold in the spaces between words. Part 2. The week stretched longer than it should have. Tuesday crawled by at the marketing firm where I spent 8 hours pretending to care about brand positioning for a client who sold artisanal soap. Sarah asked if I was feeling all right. Apparently I'd been quieter than usual, which was saying something, and I told her I was fine, which was becoming my most practiced lie. Wednesday evening found me walking past Pages and Prose for no reason I could articulate. The store was closed, metal security gate pulled down over the front windows, but I walked by anyway, twice, like I was hoping the poetry section might somehow be accessible from the sidewalk. Thursday, I realized I was counting hours until the book club meeting with the kind of attention I usually reserve for deadlines or dental appointments, things you dread and anticipate in equal measure. It was Sarah who noticed first. "You're different lately," she said over coffee Friday morning, studying me with the kind of clinical interest she usually saved for market research. "Not bad different, just less absent. I'm always present at work." "No, you're physically present. Mentally, you've been somewhere else since you moved here, but this week you keep checking your phone like you're expecting something." I wasn't checking my phone. I was thinking about Marcus's hands when he'd reached for the coffee spill, the way he'd moved through the poetry section like he belonged there, the careful attention he paid to words other people spoke. But Sarah was right about the restlessness, the sense of anticipation that had settled into my chest like a weight I couldn't name. "Maybe I'm just adjusting to the town," I said. "Maybe." But her tone suggested she didn't believe it any more than I did. Saturday, I found myself walking past Cornerstone Books again. The vintage clothing shop was busy with weekend browsers, couples holding hands while they argued about whether a 1970s leather jacket was vintage chic or trying too hard. The candle store had switched to a Halloween display, miniature pumpkins and tea lights arranged around candles that probably smelled like autumn leaves or cozy cabin. Cornerstone Books looked empty except for Janet, who was visible through the window doing something with the register. I was about to keep walking when I saw him. Marcus was inside, not browsing but working, moving books from one shelf to another with the methodical patience of someone who understood that organization was a form of care. He wore the same type of clothes as always, jeans and a sweater, but something about seeing him in the bookstore when it was closed felt different, more private, like catching someone singing when they thought no one was listening. I stood on the sidewalk for longer than I should have, watching him work. He moved efficiently but not hurriedly, reading spine labels before deciding where each book belonged. Occasionally, he'd pause to flip through something that caught his attention, but mostly he just worked with the quiet focus of someone who found comfort in useful tasks. I was about to walk away when he looked up and saw me through the window. For a moment, we just stared at each other through the glass. Then he set down the book he'd been holding and walked to the front door. I heard the lock turn and then the door opened. He didn't smile, didn't look surprised or pleased or annoyed. Just stood there looking at me with those gray-green eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. "I thought you'd be around," he said finally. Not, "What are you doing here?" or "We're closed." Just acknowledgement, like my presence was something he'd been expecting without knowing he was expecting it. "I was just walking by," I said, which was true but insufficient. "Janet asked me to help reorganize the fiction section. Authors keep getting mixed up." He stepped back from the doorway. "You can come in if you want." I wanted to. That was the problem. I wanted to more than I could justify to myself. But I found myself stepping through the doorway anyway, into the familiar smell of old books and coffee that never quite faded from the air. "You don't have to help," Marcus said, locking the door behind me. "But the company's good." The casual admission hung in the air between us. Company's good. Like he'd been working alone for hours and hadn't realized he minded until someone else was there. "What needs to be done?" I asked. He gestured toward the fiction section where several stacks of books sat on the floor next to gaps in the shelves. "Janet's been letting customers reshelve books wherever they fit. Authors are scattered everywhere. Atwood mixed in with Austen, Morrison next to Murakami. Literary chaos. The worst kind." We worked for the next hour without talking much. Marcus would hand me books and I'd find their proper places, or I'd read him author names and he'd point toward the right section. It was the kind of quiet, repetitive work that creates its own rhythm, like meditation with a practical purpose. I found myself paying attention to the way he handled books, carefully but not preciously, like someone who understood they were meant to be read, not just preserved. When he came across something he recognized, he'd pause for just a moment, the way you might when hearing a song that brought back a specific memory. "Have you read this?" he asked at one point, holding up a copy of The City in the City by China Miéville. "No, should I?" "Maybe. It's about boundaries. What happens when you pretend not to see things that are right in front of you?" There was something in his tone that made me look up from the shelf I was organizing. He was still holding the book, but he was looking at me instead of it. "Sounds complicated," I said. "Most good books are." He handed me the book and our fingers brushed again, briefly, accidentally, but with the same electric awareness as the coffee spill incident. This time, neither of us pulled away immediately. We just stood there in the fiction section of a closed bookstore, connected by the weight of a paperback novel and whatever was happening in the space between us. "I should probably get this back to Janet," Marcus said finally, taking the book and moving toward a different shelf. But the moment lingered, the way moments do when they contain more meaning than the words that created them. We finished the reorganization around 4 o'clock. The fiction section looked professional now, authors properly alphabetized, gaps filled, everything in its right place. Marcus gathered his things, the worn messenger bag, a light jacket he'd draped over one of the reading chairs, while I pretended to browse the mystery section. "Thank you," he said as we walked toward the front door, "for helping. Thank you for letting me in." Another pause, the kind that felt significant without being definable. "See you Thursday?" he asked. "Yeah, see you Thursday." He locked the door behind us and we stood on the sidewalk for a moment before heading in opposite directions. I watched him walk away down Maple Street, hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't been during the book club meetings, like he was more comfortable when there were fewer people around to perform for. Walking home, I realized something had shifted again. Not dramatically. I was learning that nothing about Marcus happened dramatically. But the careful distance we'd maintained was becoming harder to justify. We'd spent an hour working together in comfortable quiet, sharing the kind of companionable silence that usually takes much longer to develop. That night, I found myself thinking about what he'd said about the city and the city, about boundaries and pretending not to see things that are right in front of you, about the way he'd looked at me when he'd said it, like the book was a metaphor for something neither of us was ready to name out loud. Sunday passed uneventfully. Monday dragged. Tuesday crawled by with the particular weight of a week that contained one evening you're looking forward to and 6 days of waiting to get there. By Wednesday, I was antsy enough that Sarah noticed again. "You're doing that thing where you check your phone every 5 minutes but never actually have any messages," she observed over lunch. "I'm not checking my phone." "You just checked it." I had in fact just checked it. Not because I was expecting messages, I never got messages worth checking, but because looking at the screen gave my hands something to do with the restless energy that had taken up residence in my chest. "Maybe you should ask someone out," Sarah said, stabbing her salad with unnecessary force. "Get some of that nervous energy redirected towards something productive." "I'm not nervous. You're something, and it's not unhappy, which is an improvement over the last 3 months." She wasn't wrong, but I wasn't ready to examine what that meant. Wednesday evening, I found myself walking past both bookstores again. First Cornerstone Books, then Pages and Prose. Neither walk was necessary for any practical purpose, but I told myself I was getting exercise, learning the neighborhood, establishing routines that had nothing to do with hoping to accidentally encounter someone I'd see in less than 24 hours anyway. Thursday evening couldn't come fast enough and came too soon. I arrived at Cornerstone Books 15 minutes early, prepared to browse the poetry section with the kind of casual attention that might suggest I was developing a legitimate interest in contemporary verse. But when I pushed open the door, setting off the familiar brass bell, I found Marcus already there. He was standing in front of the poetry section, holding a slim volume in that careful way he had with books. When he saw me, he didn't look surprised, just nodded the same acknowledgement he'd given me every week. "You're early," I said. "So are you." "Fair point." I walked over to where he was standing, close enough to see the book in his hands, but not close enough to read the title. Up close, I could smell something like sawdust and soap, the scent of someone who worked with his hands and paid attention to being clean. "Finding anything interesting?" I asked. Instead of answering, he held out the book he'd been reading. It was a collection by a poet I'd never heard of. The Carrying by Ada Limon. The cover was simple, elegant, the kind of design that suggested the contents were substantial enough not to need flashy marketing. "This one helped, once," he said quietly. I took the book, our fingers brushing again in what was becoming a familiar accident. The pages fell open to a poem about loss and recovery, about learning to carry grief without being crushed by it. The language was precise but not cold, honest without being brutal. "Helped with what?" I asked, then immediately regretted the question. Too direct, too personal, too close to things we hadn't established the right to know about each other. But Marcus didn't seem offended by the directness. "Getting through a time when other words weren't enough," he said. "Poetry works differently sometimes. Gets to places prose can't reach." I understood that, the feeling of needing language that approached meaning sideways, that acknowledged the inadequacy of ordinary expression while still trying to express something essential. "Can I started, then stopped. "Would it be okay if I borrowed this? I'll bring it back next week." "Keep it as long as you need." Something about the way he said it made it clear this wasn't just about lending a book. It felt like an offer of something more substantial, trust maybe, or recognition. The kind of gesture that acknowledged we were moving past casual bookstore acquaintances into territory that didn't have clear boundaries. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me yet. You might hate it." "I don't think I will." We stood there in the poetry section, not quite looking at each other, both of us holding books we weren't really reading. The bookstore was filling up around us. Janet arranging chairs in the back room, other book club members arriving and making the usual small talk, but it felt like we were in our own quiet bubble. We should probably head back, Marcus said finally. Probably, but neither of us moved immediately. We stood there for another moment, surrounded by other people's attempts to make sense of longing and loss in the spaces between words, before walking toward the back room where tonight's discussion would unfold exactly like last week's and the week before, except for this. Now I was carrying something of his, and he'd chosen to give it to me. The meeting itself followed familiar patterns. Janet with her reading glasses and discussion questions. The woman with the sticky notes sharing insights she'd gleaned from online analyses. The man who related everything to his personal experience, tonight connecting The Handmaid's Tale to his concerns about government overreach and the erosion of personal freedoms. I found myself only half listening to the discussion, distracted by the weight of the poetry collection in my jacket pocket and the awareness that Marcus was 3 seats away, making notes in his margins with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. "What did everyone think of the relationship between Offred and Nick?" Janet asked. "The way Atwood handles forbidden attraction in a totalitarian society?" Several people offered observations about resistance and humanity and the power of human connection, even under oppressive circumstances. Standard insights, all accurate, all missing something essential about the way desire functions when it can't be expressed directly. "Maybe it's not about the attraction itself," I said, surprising myself by speaking up. "Maybe it's about the space between them, the things they can't say but both understand." Janet nodded encouragingly. "Can you elaborate on that?" I glanced at Marcus, who was looking at me with the same focused attention he gave to books worth reading. Something about his expression made me feel like whatever I said next might matter. "Sometimes the most powerful connections happen in silence," I said. "When you recognize something in someone else that you can't name, but you both know it's there." The room went quiet for a moment. Then Marcus spoke, his voice soft but clear. "That's exactly what I thought, too." The same words he'd used the previous weeks, but this time they felt different, more intentional. Like he was establishing a pattern, creating a private conversation within the public discussion. The meeting continued around us, but I found myself thinking about spaces between words, about the way understanding could develop without explanation, about the difference between what people said and what they meant. When the hour ended and people began gathering their things, I helped Janet stack chairs while Marcus lingered near the poetry section, apparently browsing but clearly waiting for something. When the room had mostly cleared and Janet had headed to the front of the store to lock up, he walked over to where I was folding the last of the metal chairs. "Good observation tonight," he said, "about the space between people." "Thanks. I've been thinking about that a lot lately." The space between people? The things we don't say out loud. He nodded like he understood exactly what I meant, which was both comforting and unsettling. It's one thing to have thoughts you can't articulate. It's another thing to meet someone who seems to recognize those thoughts without explanation. "I should head home," I said, though I wasn't sure why. The studio above the bakery offered nothing more compelling than the company of someone who understood the power of silence. "Yeah, me too." But again, neither of us moved immediately. We stood there in the back room of Cornerstone Books, surrounded by folded chairs and the lingering smell of coffee, both of us clearly reluctant to end whatever this was. "David," Marcus said suddenly, like he was testing the sound of my name, "are you—" He started to ask something, then stopped, shaking his head slightly. "What?" "Nothing. It's not important." But the way he said it suggested it was important, just not something he was ready to voice. We walked toward the front of the store together, past Janet, who was counting the register, toward the door with its brass bell. Outside, the evening was cold enough to see our breath, the first real hint that autumn was giving way to something harsher. "Thank you again," I said, touching the poetry collection in my jacket pocket. "For the book. Let me know what you think." "I will." Another pause, the kind that felt like it should be filled with something more significant than good night. "See you next week?" Marcus asked. "Yeah, see you next week." I watched him walk away down Maple Street, hands deep in his jacket pockets, shoulders hunched against the cold. When he disappeared around the corner, I stood there for another moment, trying to understand what was happening to me. I'd gone to a book club. I'd participated in a literary discussion. I'd been given a book of poetry by someone who noticed things like the spaces between words and why that might matter. It should have been simple, friendly but not too friendly, intellectual but not too intimate, the kind of encounter that fits neatly into the category of pleasant evening without demanding anything more. But walking home to my studio, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was shifting. Not dramatically, nothing about Marcus happened dramatically, but like a foundation settling, small adjustments that would eventually change the shape of everything built on top of them. That night I read The Carrying cover to cover. The poems were about loss and recovery, about learning to hold grief without being destroyed by it, about the way love persists even after the person you loved is gone. But they were also about recognition, the moment when you see yourself reflected in someone else's words and realize you're not as alone as you thought. One poem in particular stopped me. What if, instead of carrying the weight of what we've lost, we learn to carry the possibility of what we might still find? I read it 3 times before closing the book and setting it on the nightstand next to my bed. Outside the window, the town had settled into its evening quiet, porch lights dimmed, the last of the dinner crowd gone home, couples finishing their evening walks and heading inside to continue conversations in voices too quiet to hear. It was the kind of scene that would have made Michael wistful, I realized. He'd have found something poetic in the ordinary domesticity of it, some observation about the beauty of other people's contentment. And I'd have agreed, because I usually agreed with Michael, and we'd have stood there together feeling connected to something larger than ourselves. But Michael wasn't here, and I wasn't the person who'd stood at windows with him, finding meaning in streetlights and the distant sound of other people's lives. I was someone else now, someone who went to book clubs and helped reorganize fiction sections and accepted gifts of poetry from men with careful hands and tired eyes. Someone who was learning to carry the possibility of what I might still find instead of just the weight of what I'd lost. It was a small shift, barely noticeable. But lying in bed that night, holding Ada Limon's words in my memory, I felt something like hope stirring in my chest. Tentative and fragile and probably temporary, but real enough to acknowledge. I fell asleep thinking about gray-green eyes and the space between words, about the way understanding could develop without explanation, about the difference between what people said and what they meant. And for the second week in a row, I dreamed about something other than silence growing like mold in the spaces where conversation used to live. Friday brought rain. Not the gentle autumn drizzle that makes everything look romantic, but the serious kind of rain that turns sidewalks into shallow rivers and makes you question your choice not to own an umbrella. I spent the day inside the marketing firm, watching water streak down the windows, while I pretended to care about brand positioning for a client who made artisanal soap with names like Lavender Dreams and Eucalyptus Awakening. Saturday was worse, the kind of cold, steady downpour that makes the whole world feel gray and waterlogged. I spent the morning reading, trying to focus on a novel I'd been struggling with for weeks, but my attention kept drifting to the poetry collection on my nightstand. Marcus's book, the one he'd said helped once. By Sunday, the rain had settled into a persistent drizzle that seemed likely to continue indefinitely. I walked to the grocery store and back, hood up, hands deep in my jacket pockets, dodging puddles and wondering why I'd chosen to live in a town where I knew no one and had nothing to do on weekends except read books and avoid thinking about the choices that had brought me here. Monday crawled by. Tuesday felt endless. Wednesday dragged with the particular weight of a week that contained one evening you're looking forward to and everything else. By Thursday evening, I was restless enough that I left work early and walked to Cornerstone Books through a drizzle that couldn't decide if it wanted to be rain or just aggressive humidity. I was soaked by the time I reached Maple Street, my jacket dark with water and my hair plastered to my skull in a way that probably looked exactly as attractive as it felt. The bookstore was still closed. I was 20 minutes early. but I could see Janet inside moving around behind the counter. I was about to take shelter under the awning of the vintage clothing shop when I saw Marcus walking toward me from the opposite direction. He was as soaked as I was, maybe worse. His jacket was the kind of canvas material that absorbs water instead of repelling it, and his dark hair was dripping onto his shoulders. He looked like he'd been walking in the rain for longer than was strictly necessary, like someone who'd left home early for reasons he couldn't quite explain to himself. We reached the door of Cornerstone Books at the same time, both of us dripping and miserable and probably looking like we'd been through some kind of minor natural disaster. "Jesus," Marcus said, which was the first time I'd heard him swear. "When did it get this bad?" "About 20 minutes ago, right when I left work." Janet looked up as we approached the door, saw our waterlogged condition, and immediately unlocked it to let us in. "You two look like drowned rats," she said cheerfully. Come in, come in. I'll put coffee on." We stood in the entryway, dripping onto the hardwood floor, both of us trying to wring water out of our jackets without making an even bigger mess. Marcus's sweater had gone dark with moisture clinging to his shoulders and chest in a way that made me look anywhere else except directly at him. "I have towels in the back," Janet said, bustling toward the rear of the store. "Hang your jackets on the radiator. They'll dry faster there." We followed her instructions with the awkward efficiency of people trying not to acknowledge that they were both half-dressed and dripping in a public space. Marcus peeled off his canvas jacket and hung it on the old cast-iron radiator near the poetry section. Underneath, his sweater was only slightly less wet, and I found myself noticing the way it outlined his shoulders, the careful movements of someone who is used to physical work. I hung my own jacket next to his, trying not to think about how domestic the gesture felt, how much like the kind of thing couples do without thinking about it. Janet returned with a stack of mismatched towels that looked like they'd been salvaged from various yard sales over the years. "Other folks won't be here for another 15 minutes at least," she said. "Take your time getting dried off." She headed back to the front of the store, leaving us alone with the towels and the sound of rain against the windows and the particular intimacy that comes from sharing a minor crisis with someone you're already paying too much attention to. "This is ridiculous," Marcus said, running a towel through his hair. "I checked the weather this morning. It was supposed to be partly cloudy. Weather in this town seems to have its own agenda. Everything in this town has its own agenda." There was something in his tone that made me look up from drying my arms. He was looking out the window at the rain, but his expression suggested he was thinking about more than just unexpected weather. "How long have you lived here?" I asked. 2 years, almost 3. He finished with his hair and started working on his sweater, pressing the towel against the worst of the wet spots. "Long enough to know that partly cloudy means bring an umbrella, and that the local forecast is more like a suggestion than actual information." "Why did you stay?" The question came out before I'd decided to ask it, too personal, too direct, too close to things we hadn't established the right to know about each other. But Marcus didn't seem bothered by the directness. Same reason most people stay anywhere, I guess. It's easier than leaving. I understood that, the inertia of settling somewhere, even when that somewhere isn't necessarily where you meant to end up. The way temporary situations become permanent through the simple passage of time and the absence of compelling reasons to be anywhere else. "What about you?" he asked. "Planning to stay?" "I don't know. Maybe. I'm still figuring things out." "What kind of things?" Another too personal question, but delivered with the same casual directness he'd used, like we were past the point of pretending we were just book club acquaintances who happened to get caught in the rain together. "The kind of things you figure out when you leave somewhere you thought you belonged," I said. Marcus nodded like he understood exactly what I meant, which was both comforting and unsettling. It's one thing to have thoughts you can't articulate. It's another to meet someone who seems to recognize those thoughts without explanation. We stood there in the poetry section of Cornerstone Books, drying off with mismatched towels while rain drummed against the windows and the radiator made small settling noises as our jackets began to dry. Neither of us was talking, but it wasn't the awkward silence of people who'd run out of things to say. More like the comfortable quiet that develops between people who don't need to fill every moment with words. I found myself paying attention to the way Marcus moved, efficiently but not hurriedly, with the careful coordination of someone who is used to working with his hands. When he bent to wring water from the hem of his sweater, I noticed the line of his shoulders, the way his hair curled slightly at the base of his neck where it was still damp. "Better," he said finally, straightening up and running a hand through his hair one more time. "Much better." We folded the towels and set them aside, then stood there for another moment, both of us clearly reluctant to move away from the quiet intimacy of the moment. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against the glass, and I could hear Janet moving around in the front of the store, probably setting up the coffee station for the book club meeting. "We should probably," Marcus started, then trailed off. "Yeah, probably." But neither of us moved. We stood there in the poetry section, close enough that I could smell sawdust and soap and something else, something warm and essentially him. Close enough to see the tired lines around his eyes, the small scar on his jaw that I hadn't noticed before, the way he was looking at me like he was trying to solve a problem that didn't have an obvious solution. "David," he said quietly. "Yeah? I'm glad you came back. To the book club." The admission hung in the air between us, more significant than it should have been for such a simple statement. But it felt like the kind of truth that required acknowledging, the kind of honest moment that changes the weight of everything that comes after it. "I'm glad you were here," I said. "I'm always here." "I know." We looked at each other for another moment, and I felt something shifting in the space between us. Not dramatically, nothing about Marcus happened dramatically, but like a foundation settling. Small adjustments that would eventually change the shape of everything built on top of them. Then Janet called from the front of the store that other people were arriving, and the moment dissolved into the practical necessities of book club meetings and literary discussions, and all the ordinary interactions that provide structure for the extraordinary ones. But I carried the weight of that moment, the intimacy of shared shelter, the admission of gladness, the way he'd said my name like he was testing its weight, through the entire evening and into the days that followed. The book club meeting itself was standard. The Handmaid's Tale discussion continued from the previous week, with the usual mix of insights and personal anecdotes and observations that ranged from profound to pedestrian. But I found myself distracted by the awareness that Marcus and I had shared something earlier, something that felt more significant than getting caught in the rain together.